you've mentioned in other interviews that a lot of the framework that people use to understand withdrawal from Afghanistan is comparing the cost of the war to potential domestic spending for social welfare programs or other things that could benefit Americans. Um, you've obviously pointed out that this is a moral issue that we owe Afghanistans after decades of destroying their infrastructure, decades of murder, decades of terror. What's a better framework to talk about ending US military campaigns? And as a follow up, what do we owe Afghanis as we withdraw? And what can the left do to put pressure on the US government to make sure that we are in some way repairing the vast amounts of destruction that have happened there?
Well, there are some concrete things. You're right about the framework. That's the way it's discussed. And it's true that the crazy war spending in general, $780 billion war Pentagon budget, is first of all endangering us very much. And it's also taking away resources that are badly needed for other purposes. That's quite apart from Afghanistan. So that point is correct, but that's not the framework for looking at what happens when we attack and destroy other countries. Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen right now, a whole long list. Yes, we're responsible for doing something to try to help them escape from the wreckage for which we are substantially responsible. There are concrete things. One is we should be admitting Afghan refugees, no bureaucratic hassles, no putting them off in some other place. They should be treated decently. And incidentally, that's not the whole story. There are plenty of people right now, not very far from where I live in Tucson, who are still escaping the ravages of the Reagan's brutal terrorist wars in Central America. They're fleeing from the wreckage. What do? We block them. We bribe Mexico to keep them from ever reaching our borders. When they get here, we stick them in what amounts to concentration camps. We don't have to go through the details, you know it better than I do. Well, okay, not hardly the way to deal with the crimes that we've committed. Most of the turned for a while, maybe still, the plurality of the refugees were coming from Honduras. That's a reflection of President Obama and Hillary Clinton's recognition of the military junta, which overthrew a mildly reformist government. The U.S. was practically alone in that. The coup was denounced all over. Clinton and Obama wouldn't call it a coup because that meant they'd have to stop funding the military that was throwing out the government and turning Honduras into one of the murder capitals of the world. Around a fake election, which everyone denounced. Obama, Clinton praised it as an important step to democracy. Now, people are fleeing. So what do? Well, take a look at the border. That's what we do. So yes, it's much more than Afghans. Second thing we should do is put an end to this disgraceful program of putting sanctions on Afghanistan. I don't like the Taliban. You don't like them, but that's no reason for punishing Afghans. They need the humanitarian aid badly. It's Afghan people who are starving, not the Taliban leaders. Sanctions in general, very generally, punish the population, not the leadership. That was true of the sanctions on Iraq, sanctions on Iran, on Cuba, on Venezuela. It's just a way of punishing the people. We actually know the reasons. They're sometimes even announced. So in the case of Cuba, which is one of the worst atrocities of the modern world, the US began back in 1960 to punish Cubans, not the leadership. for the reason that was explicitly stated by State Department representatives. They recognized that then Castro was very popular, and the only way to overthrow the government was to foment discontent among the population, make life so impossible that people would overthrow the government. Of course, it wasn't the only way. Kennedy also launched a major terrorist war, which practically brought the world to nuclear disaster in 1962. Speak of harboring terrorists. But the sanctions then aren't designed. They were intensified by Clinton when Cuba was in a desperate position after the Russians pulled out. Clinton outflanked Bush from the right to increase the sanctions so as to starve the population and beat them into submission so they'll overthrow the government. That's exactly what's going on now. Okay. So, incidentally, the United States is the only country in the world that can impose sanctions. And the sanctions are third-party sanctions. Everyone has to obey them, or else they get tossed out of the international financial system. The U.S. is alone in the world in the capacity to do that. Major form of state terrorism. Case of Afghanistan coming along as another one. We should unblock the IMF and World Bank funding. They're blocking funding, of course, under U.S. pressure. That should be stopped. We should make every possibility for the Taliban to somehow, and the population to somehow solve their own problems in whatever way they can, not a good way. There would have been better ways, I think, starting back in the late 1980s. For example, it's touching to see the concern for women's rights now. Everybody's concerned with women's rights. How wonderful and touching. What happened in the late 1980s when the Russians had a regime in place, the Jacobin regime, which was protecting women's rights. The women were going to university, wearing whatever clothes they want. They did have problems. The problems were the US-backed Islamic maniacs like Jacobin Hekmatyar, who were throwing acid in the faces of women with the wrong clothes. Well, that was the late 80s. Actually, that was written about by very credible people. Russell Basu, leading international feminist woman who organized the International Year of Women in 1974. She was the UN rapporteur for women's rights in Afghanistan. She wrote articles about this, sent them to US journals, wouldn't publish them. Even Ms. Magazine wouldn't publish them. Wrong story, We're not supporting women's rights now. Because it was a Russian-run regime. Now, we're concerned with women's rights. Yes, very moving.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.